Hello, so today I thought we'd have a play with this, which is a thermal till roll. You can get normal till rolls, but this is the type that goes into computerised tills and credit cards machines. This is a normal till roll, which is just paper, not heat reactive, and this one is heat reactive. I'll show you what happens when you heat it, and then we'll have a play with some interesting effects you can create. What I must say before you start doing anything is make sure that you're on a surface that doesn't matter if it gets hot. Be careful with your heat gun, and also the effects that you get when you heat them aren't permanent. If you look at any receipts that you've got printed on thermal paper sort of from maybe a year ago, you'll notice that the printing fades. It eventually vanishes because it's not archival. So whatever effects you get will not be permanent. But that's quite interesting because you can look back at your artwork later on and see how, when some of the effects have gone, what you're left with. So as always with a lot of mixed media, you're best if you do a lot of layering, because then when one layer vanishes, you've still got the top layers. You could also go back, and if it was on a project that was okay to be heated, just give it a blast with a heat gun, and you might get an interesting effect different to the original effect. So this is what happens if you heat a thermal paper. This is just a normal heat gun, craft heat gun, and I'm just going to blast an area so you can see what happens when you do that. So that's what happens, and this is how it prints your till receipt. The technology heats the paper and then it prints. I don't know if it's done with a laser, I don't know the technicalities. So that, if you've got anything that you apply heat to, if you've got the paper and you apply heat to it, unprotected, it goes black. I'll now show you the next interesting thing, which is if you apply something like ink, we'll do that in 2 strips there, and this is just for demonstration purposes. There you are. Can you see the colour stops because it is protected the paper from the heat. So if I put a little bit of that on there and then heat it, and you see where I've had the other till roll, it's protected it. This has gone even blacker, but you can still see the green. It doesn't show through, because normally if you put ink onto something black, it goes darker. But that ink protects your surface. Similarly, if you add water, now it is a little bit different with the ink to the water, because the water evaporates. If you kept going, it would go completely black, because as the water evaporates, it lets the heat get to the paper. But as you can see, that's quite an interesting pattern to have as a background, and it depends whether you've got a thick, heavy mister like that, or we'll do it with a fine mister. This is just a little mini mister. And can you see it's evaporated a lot quicker, so we've just got little areas where it's protected the paper. So quite a lot of water is better than a little bit of water. So we'll move it along a little and we'll do some stamping. So if I do something like picked raspberry distress ink, all my acrylic blocks are upstairs, so this is a jam jar lid that I've got my butterfly mounted on. You have to forgive me. So we've got picked raspberry on there. So that's 2 bits of stamping. Now what we'll do is, I've got some water here, cleaning my brushes. If we dip something like a tube in and put a reasonable amount of water, do a bit of mark making. That out of the way. And then we'll heat again. Now this is where I've put too much water on, so this is where the water's run away. So it's gone in rivers. Not particularly struck on that effect, but what I can do is I can add a little bit of normal stamping on the top. So can you see, because it's white, the other stamping shows up better. So you can see the normal stamping better where the water has protected the paper. Where it's gone dark grey, you don't notice it as much. So moving on from that, and can you see that the distress ink shows up nicely on the top? It doesn't fade into the background. So moving on from that, what you could do is quite a big blast of water. And get the majority of it out so it doesn't move as much. Just an old tea towel. So then you've got areas that you could stamp, say, numbers or something like that into. Moving along a little bit further, you can, I'm just going to put this so that the colour shows up. That over a little bit. A couple of colours that coordinate. So that's distressing. In 2 shades of green. Just make it run a little bit. So we've picked up some colour there. I won't waste that. And then we'll heat it. So that's yet another really interesting effect. Just get a little bit of paper just to mop a little bit of that up. And then we can it. And then, let's see, what shall we stamp on the top? Must be something quite organic. Here we are, we've got an indigo blue stamp, which is bubbles, which is quite nice. So then we'll go for evergreen bough, which is one of the colours we used. And we'll just do some random stamping. More. So there we are. You can see you can get some really interesting effects. Now when the black disappears, you will still have the colour on the paper, so it'll be a completely different look, but it'll probably be just as interesting. But just be aware that these things don't last forever. It isn't sort of permanent. So don't do anything that's going to be sold or a keepsake, because it's not archival. It will not last forever. But that's quite an interesting effect. You can also, if you've got heat-proof things, you can pop things on. I'll do something like that. And what else shall we do? What else have we got that's heat-proof? I'll try this. I haven't tried glass. It does conduct heat, so... This one, which was cardboard, must have conducted a bit of heat. But as you can see, again, you've got a protected area and you've got quite an interesting effect. So then you can also do some mark making with your, maybe better with a bigger ink pad, but and you could do smaller circles with a smaller tube. And some on the black and the grey. Just remember that you can't heat set anything or else you will lose your effect that you've created. So I would have to wait for that to air dry before I used it, because it will still be tacky. So that's another effect. What I'll do is I'll move that out of the way and I'll show you what I've created on the roll that I started. This was the first roll that I started. This was done with vintage photo. That was where the glue was, which held the end of the roll to the other part of the roll so that it didn't spring open. So it was sort of glued like that. I stamped, did some stamping in vintage photo. I splashed some water, heated it. Where the glue was, it protected it. Where I'd done the stamping, it protected it. I also then just glued some bits and pieces on to make it into what's called a snippet roll. So there's little bits of vintage paper, there's a calendar number, there's some staples. So the idea of the snippet roll is you either do it just as a therapeutic thing and you're just creating on a little roll that doesn't take up much room and you just keep it and like it. You can journal on the back if you want, to get out your feelings or whatever, but you can also tear it and put it in a journal, and again it will change over time, but that's quite nice because you can look back in years to come and see how it's changed. This has got stamping on top once I'd heated it as well, so I could say tear that across there and that would be a little edge to a page or on a pocket or whatever. This bit here is just torn paper glued on. Again, stamping and water before I heated it just to protect it a little. Again, another little cluster. This has had some stamping and some water treatment. I stamped in black once it had dried, but I also stamped in white on the top. Again, more stamping and a cluster. That's stamping on white on the top once I'd heated it. And because I've inked it up in vintage photo, you can see the brown of the vintage photo, but it's got grey underneath, so it gives it a real aged look to it, but also a distressed look to it. I think I'm going to keep adding clusters to this roll and just keep going. So this is all vintage photo. That's a little cluster. Then I went on to, I think this was either Candied Apple or Barn Door. So you can see I've got the colour where I've added some ink by splattering it, but I've also added white as well. So both protected the background from the heat. So it just went grey. Same again, and then I've coordinated my clusters with the ink that I added and just did more stamping and inking. Again with the blue. I love the way the Distress inks look really vintage and chalky, because these are just normal distress inks, not distress oxides, and they go really chalky on this paper, and I love that. So that was a blue. I stamped with an acrylic stamp using green, and again it has protected it slightly, so you can see the leaves and the stamping, and it's just protected it. Again, some more red, some water, and then stamping, or stamping and then water you could do. That's just splashes. That was where I put something on to protect it, and then added some water later. So you can play around and try all sorts and just keep going. This was a nice pale, I think that's scattered straw, and that looks really nice against the grey. This is where I just brushed on some scattered straw, very, very vaguely, and added some water as well, and then did a lot of black stamping on the top after I'd heated it, which looked very nice. Then I think we're back to vintage photo again. I think that was Victorian velvet. That was just water, no colour. We're back to the red again. And then we're on to Victorian velvet stamping on the top and a little bit of inking. I think I will stamp again these in black, because I think they would look better in black. But you can go on and on and on, as you can see I have. So have fun, have a play. So I've just done a little bit of the thermal till roll, basically so you can see how it looks before you heat it. This one has got some stamping with memento, which is black. I've applied some vintage photo with a brush, just a little bit backwards and forwards, and also a little bit of tea dye, which is a nice sort of peachy brown backwards and forwards. I've also applied some with my sponge. When you apply the ink with your sponge, just be aware that it won't move, it won't blend. So if I go down like that and then try to move it, it doesn't blend out. You're left with a blob, which can be quite nice if you do multiple sort of circles. It can create a nice effect, but just be aware it won't blend. Your distress ink won't blend on this paper. Once it's on and it won't move, which is quite nice because you've got a more don't know quite how to say it, but what you see is what you get. It won't move any further. So I've done a small piece. This was just cleaning my stamp off, and then there's this area here. So we'll heat it and see how it turns out. So you can see what I've done. I've done quite a few layers of different things, and then we'll see how it changes once we heat it. I'll do this small piece first. Now that's interesting because this was the underside, and so it's actually, I didn't know that, it's one-sided. So if you wanted to use it and not have the black, you could use the underside and it won't be affected, but the other side will. That's very interesting. I've learnt something else today, which is great. So we'll do this bit. There we are. So can you see, because the tea dye, tea stain, tea dye, I was right, distressing is quite a pale one. It shows up against the dark grey black a lot better, but the black still shows up, but so does some of the brown. You can actually add more brown later and make it more distressed looking by just inking over the top and make it sort of more vintagey looking, which I actually like. So I'm going to add a bit more on the top. As I say, it doesn't blend, doesn't your ink? But once it's gone grey black, you don't notice the fact that it doesn't blend as much. When it goes white again in the future, you might do. But as we've just learned, if you want to do this and have it so it doesn't go black when it's heated, you could use the reverse. So you could use the reverse and do heat embossing on it and it wouldn't turn black. So now I think I'm going to tear that bit off and I'm going to use a little bit of this with it, because this is just not gone black. That coordinates quite nicely. So I'll just do a little bit of brown just to dull it down a little bit. I think I'll tear the edges as well. I don't want a straight edge. That's the one thing, they do get a straight edge, which I'm not so struck on. So I could put that piece on there. I've got a little bit of music paper which has got a bit of the, oh, that's not going to stop on bookbinding on. This bit has. So I could layer those up like that. I could add, what shall we add? A little bit of corrugated cardboard poking out at the bottom. And then what I'm quite fond of at the moment is stapling things together. So we've got that little group. Get my stapler and staple it together. And there we are, a nice little cluster. I could actually put some twine or something on there as well, and then I could just tear that little cluster off, ink the edges up a little bit more. I could distress the edges of this a little bit, and that would be a nice little cluster to go in a journal.